They say we're only supposed to love those who share our land, our language, our side of the war. But I learned, far too late, that the truest kind of love can come from the very place we were taught to hate. While I stitched up wounds that didn't belong to me and smiled through lips cracked from the cold in France, I heard my name spoken in a voice only he knew how to use. A name said with reverence, with longing, with a pain that crossed every border. And it was mine. I was a nurse, trained to heal, not to feel. But the moment that man in the enemy's uniform whispered my name for the first time, the world trembled in a way I hadn't felt before. He didn't speak my language. He didn't know my story. But when he spoke, it felt like home. And right there in a field soaked in blood, mud, and silence, I found something no one would ever believe. A love with no flag. A love that survived only because it stayed hidden where no one could see it. Deep inside my chest. If you think war only destroys, maybe you haven't heard stories like mine. The kind that never make it into history books but haunt you night after night when you light candles for those who never got a grave. Stay with me till the end, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just a war story. It's a story of soul, of secrets, and of survival. And maybe, if you've ever loved someone you weren't supposed to, you'll understand what I was never allowed to say out loud. My name is Mabel Frances Chapman. I'm 90 years old and I live in a house that time nearly swallowed, deep in rural Ohio. The garden that was once my mother's pride has become nothing more than a bed of brittle leaves, and the hallway wall holds an empty frame that stares at me like it's still waiting for a photo that never belonged there. My hair is thin now, yellowing at the ends, held up by old metal clips that barely do more than hold onto a memory. I wear the same gray dress most days, and a navy beret that once matched my eyes, back when they were still bright, still hopeful, still naive. Now, they just watch, quietly. I was a nurse during the war, the real one, with its full name, World War II. I served at a critical evacuation base in France, dangerously close to the front lines. I remember the constant hum of planes, the muffled cries echoing down canvas corridors, the smell of blood and ether laced with fear. I remember the cold hands I held until mine went numb, and the whispered last words of soldiers who were far from home and a breath away from death. But there's something I remember more clearly than all of that. Him, and the way he said my name in a forbidden tongue. If you've got a moment, sit with me. Grab a blanket, pretend we're sipping tea, and let me tell you this story. Not out of scandal, not out of longing, but out of justice. Because some stories need to be heard. And some names, even when forbidden, deserve to be remembered. This is a war story, a moving one, and it won't be easy for me to make it to the end. But if you're willing to listen with an open heart, I promise you'll understand what I mean by silence, by loss, and by a secret that's been kept for decades. So stay till the end, and if this story touches you in any way, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. It's the kind of gesture that warms the bones of an old woman like me. When I first arrived at the evacuation airbase, the ground was still trembling. Not from the bombings. They said those had ended the night before. But from the bodies that kept arriving in windowless trucks. I stepped down from a smaller vehicle, clutching a worn leather suitcase tied with fabric and a hand-labeled tag. Mabel Frances Chapman, 21 years old, O positive, volunteer nurse, basic field training. That's all it said on paper, but it said nothing about what I was carrying inside. I was a blacksmith's daughter, granddaughter of a woman who gave birth at home, niece to 3 soldiers who never made it back from the last war. I carried the kind of blood, that already knew pain before I ever saw anyone else's. The smell was the first thing that separated us from life before. It was a mix of iodine, wet earth, and burned flesh. Not the kind of smell you could wash off. It stuck to your eyelashes, crept under your nails, hid in the hem of the white dress they gave us to pretend there was still some barrier between us and death. But there wasn't. And that was the first thing I learned. War doesn't wear gloves. It grabs you with bare hands. And in a hurry. The makeshift infirmary was inside a hangar that used to house patrol planes. Now it held broken men. Bodies under thick sheets, rows of metal cots, aluminum trays with tools far too cold for the heat of so much pain. On my first day, I remember bending down to pick up a fallen syringe, and my knee brushed a dark stain on the floor. I didn't have the nerve to ask whether it was blood or motor oil. But honestly, back then everything was blood. Blood dripping from poorly tied splints, blood crusted on reused bandages, blood in the eyes of men who wanted to die but hadn't yet. My job was simple, they said. Administer morphine, change gauze, hold hands if the chaplain didn't make it in time. But no one said anything about the eyes. No one prepared me to face 19-year-olds looking at me like I was the last living person they'd ever see. And in a way, I was. There was this boy named Collins who called me Angel Nurse. His jaw was wired shut, couldn't talk properly. But he always whispered that when I came near. One day he just looked at me and said nothing. That's how I knew it was his last morning. I started walking between beds with a rhythm I only noticed months later. It was almost like I was stepping through a minefield of memories. I moved carefully, afraid to step on someone's name, or on a piece of their story they had dropped. Because despite what people think, not everyone screamed. Some died in silence, and those were the ones who haunted my dreams the most. The ones who left quietly, like war had stolen even their right to cry out. I slept in an adjoining tent, sharing a bunk with another nurse named Rose. She was from Mississippi, had thick straw blonde hair, and a faith that didn't shake. She'd pray before bed and kept an open Bible on her pillow, like the words alone could protect her. Sometimes I'd hear her crying softly, but we never talked about it. No one did. We talked about coffee, letters from home, clean socks. It was like that fake normalcy was the only thing keeping us from going mad. But there was an invisible trail that connected the infirmary to our sleeping quarters. I called it, in my mind, the walk through war's stumps. It was the only moment we could breathe, even if the air was thick with smoke and silence. Walking there alone, my boots sinking slightly into the dark mud, felt like passing through a hallway of ghosts. I could feel the stares of the ones who'd gone, hear the whispers of those still waiting. And somewhere between one breath and the next, a strange thought crossed my mind. Was there, somewhere out there, an enemy nurse walking a similar path? Were her footsteps echoing the same way, just on the other side of pain? It was during one of those solitary walks that I first saw him, sitting in the shadow of the communications tower, part of his face covered by a blanket. At first, I thought he was one of ours, waiting for triage. But as I got closer, I saw he wasn't wearing our uniform. His was grayish-brown, cut differently, boots with no laces, and a badge I didn't recognize at first. My heart froze. A wounded prisoner? A mistake? Or some kind of test? He didn't speak. Neither did I. But our eyes locked for far too long to be accidental. It was like time bent itself just for a second, paused long enough for me to memorize that face. A bruised chin, a swollen eye, and breathing so labored it sounded like each inhale came from somewhere forbidden. I didn't know it yet, but that was the man who would one day say my name in a language I was taught to fear. And still, I'd hear it like music, That was the first time war lost its shape for me. Until then, it had meant trenches, pain, wounds. But in front of that man, silent and wrong, war turned into doubt. And doubt is where every secret begins. Or maybe every love. There was no predictable rhythm to who came in and out of the infirmary. Sometimes in the middle of the night, trucks would arrive with soldiers covered in mud, screaming names of men who weren't alive anymore. Other times they came in total silence, eyes wide open like they no longer belonged to this world. It was a constant rotation of bodies, wounds, voices, smells. And we, the nurses, learned not to ask questions. The only sound we cared about was breathing. If they were breathing, we treated. If they stopped, we alerted. That's how you survived inside a soulless machine like that. That morning the cold had crept through every seam of the tent. I remember it took me longer than usual to tie my shoes. There was a small tear in the left sole, and I could feel the wet grass soaking through my socks. It was late October, and in some parts of France, fall felt like winter. I walked to the infirmary in short steps, trying to ignore how stiff my joints were. Inside, the smell was the same as always. Expired antiseptic, hidden blood, and fear. But something was off that morning. A muffled whisper that didn't belong. A tension without a name. It was the head sergeant who called me over. Her face, blank as always, just pointed to a stretcher in the far corner, next to the wooden divider we used to hide the most brutal surgeries. As I got closer, I noticed the sheet covering the man was different. Too clean, too perfectly tucked. Like someone was trying to hide not just the body, but the story behind it. And lying there was the man who would unravel everything I thought I knew about war and about myself. His eyes were closed, but he wasn't asleep. It was more like a vigil, like he was listening to something from another world before deciding whether to return. His face was bruised, nose slightly crooked, mouth parted with a dried thread of blood at the corner. His hair was dark, straight, longer than what our boys usually wore, and his skin, fair, but with something about it that didn't match the features of American soldiers. There was a foreign trace to him, a shape that didn't fit. And I just knew. Not because someone told me, not because I saw papers, but somewhere deep in my body, I knew. He was the enemy. It took a few hours to confirm. A triage error, they said. Or maybe a rushed decision. He'd been found unconscious on the battlefield and brought in with our own. No time to sort things out. He was German, an enemy soldier, one of them. And yet, he would be treated. Because war has its own twisted logic. One of its greatest ironies is this. Even the one who aimed at you might end up in your care. And my hands were nurses' hands. A woman's hands. The kind that hadn't been trained to hate precisely. For days after, he said nothing. But not out of pride or defiance. It was like pain itself had taken away his ability to speak. Still, there was something in his eyes. A childlike effort to make sense of the world around him. And I, maybe out of instinct, maybe curiosity, began to speak to him softly. Simple words. Water. Pain. Sleep. I pointed, repeated. He never replied, but he stared at me, like he was memorizing every syllable, like he was learning a forbidden prayer. Then, one afternoon, while the sheets hung drying in the sun, and the infirmary felt quieter than usual, he spoke. Not a sentence, just one word. And it wasn't English. It was my name. Or something very close. It came out strange, tangled in his throat, but it was unmistakable. Mabel. Dragging the vowel like he didn't want to spit it out, but hold it. My name spoken in a language war had taught me to fear. And in that moment, the world went completely still. Like the entire front had fallen silent just so I could hear that. I wanted to run, pretend it hadn't happened, tell the sergeant he was hallucinating, but I stayed. And he said it again. "Mabel!" And then he smiled. A small, tired smile, but real. As if my name was shelter. As if, for a moment, he'd found in me something that reminded him of home. And that tore me apart. Because up until then, I'd believed my job was about bandages, about needles, antibiotics. But no, it was about holding on to the last shred of humanity after everything else had been ripped away. The others didn't know, or pretended not to. There was always distance between the wounded and the ones who treated them. And with him, it was no different. But I started noticing my visits were getting longer. I brought him more water, fluffed his pillow better, changed his dressings with extra care. And in return, he gave me something I didn't even know I still needed. His gaze. Not like a man looks at a woman, but like one survivor looks at another, with gratitude, with wonder, with disbelief that he was still alive. We never really talked. The language barrier, of course. But also something else. A mutual pact of silence, because words give shape. And during that phase of the war, nothing was allowed to have shape. A misread gesture could cost you your career. A misplaced kindness could get written up. Still, something was growing. In the silence, in the stares, in the faintest of smiles. Something forbidden, but inevitable. And night after night, I climbed back into my bunk with my chest tight, knowing this wasn't just another war story anymore. It was becoming something else. A story full of feeling, a secret. A secret that wore boots and spoke my name with an accent. A secret that, sooner or later, someone was bound to notice. There was a time when I believed love needed words. That it only existed when someone said, "I love you," or signed a letter with, "Forever yours." But at that air base, surrounded by screams of pain and the stench of gunpowder, I learned there are languages the heart understands without any translation. And it was with him that I learned that. Through gestures, pauses, lingering eyes, hands that never touched but always knew where the other was. He taught me a language I didn't know I understood. A language made of silence. After I heard my name come out of his mouth in that strange way, like someone whispering a prayer, I started listening more closely. Really listening. And not just to the sounds. I listened to what his body said when the bandages hurt. What his eyes asked when the water was too lukewarm. What his shoulders whispered when I adjusted the blanket with more tenderness than neutrality should allow. He told me things no nurse should ever hear from a man wearing a different uniform. But what scared me more was that I answered, even in silence. One day I found a torn piece of paper beside his bed. It was stained with dried blood and covered in scribbles that I guessed were German. I slipped it into my pocket without knowing why. That night, under the weak beam of a flashlight, I tried to make sense of the lines. The handwriting was steady, elegant, and in the middle of the text there was something that looked like my name. Again. That same drawn-out sound, like the word had been stretched by longing. I stood there, the paper in my hand, my heart racing like I'd crossed into territory that didn't belong to me. And that's when I realized I had already crossed the line. War taught us to hate with precision, in training manuals, on posters, through the mouths of our superiors. The enemy had a face, an accent, a flag, an enemy you could recognize and reject. But him, lying there, fragile, cheeks sunken, body scarred. He didn't look like the enemy. He looked like a man, a tired man, displaced, ripped from his world and thrown into ours with no choice. And that confused me, because back then, doubt was more dangerous than any bomb. I started studying his eyes. They changed color with the weather, sometimes green, sometimes gray. And every time he looked at me, it wasn't like other soldiers looked at nurses. There was curiosity, yes, but also respect, as if I were a mystery he wanted to understand slowly, carefully. And that disarmed me. I spent my days armored against collapse, against exhaustion, against horror. I wore strength like a uniform, even when my knees threatened to give out. But in front of him, I was just Mabel, a woman trying to understand why her soul was responding to a voice that didn't speak her language. There was a moment I'll never forget. I was changing his sheets and accidentally exposed a pendant tucked under his blanket. It was simple, darkened metal on a thick cord. When I went to cover it back up, he grabbed my wrist. It was the only time he ever touched me. Not with desire, but with a quiet desperation. His eyes begged me not to take it from him. And then, with effort, he whispered a single word I've never forgotten. Mutter. It took me a few seconds. Then I remembered. That meant mother in German. It had belonged to her, and he needed to keep it. In that moment, everything made sense. There wasn't a monster in front of me. There was a sun. I walked back to my quarters as if my boots were full of mud. My feet were heavy. My head throbbed. But it was my heart that screamed, because I knew. From that day on, I wouldn't be able to see him the way others did. He'd shown me something far too intimate to erase. A symbol, a secret, a key to a part of him no one else had touched. And I couldn't tell anyone. A single whisper, and he'd be taken away. Or worse, forgotten. And I couldn't let him disappear from the story. I started bringing him little things hidden in my pockets. Bread, a piece of fruit when we had it, a clean cloth that smelled faintly of lavender, just so he could feel something that wasn't pain. He thanked me with his eyes, and in return I learned to read his gestures. A raised eyebrow meant pain. A furrowed brow asked for more water. A slow blink meant fear. We built a language with no grammar but a syntax of care. And that sustained me. But it also broke me, little by little, because I knew it couldn't last. War is made of short moments and long goodbyes. And even if no one said anything, I saw the sideways glances, the whispers, the sudden silences. I was already under suspicion. And in war, suspicion is a sentence. Still, I went on, like someone dancing at the edge of a cliff, like someone hiding a white handkerchief under her uniform, like someone who believes that even if the world ends, maybe love can save some piece of us. And deep down, I needed someone to say my name, even if it came in the enemy's tongue. Because in that base, among blood, bone, and silence, no one else saw me as a person. Except him. That was the war story I lived in secret. A secret that looked me in the eyes and said, Mabel, like it meant life. A secret that, soon, would have to vanish. There was a code we swore to follow. Not in front of an altar, not with witnesses. It was the kind of oath you make in silence, somewhere between an anatomy lecture and a wound-cleaning session, when you're taught to scrub a body like you're cleansing the whole world. The first time I heard the word neutrality, I didn't even know what it meant. It sounded like a place that belonged to no one, but where everyone could pass through. And that's what was expected of us. The war nurses, to be that place, not country, not emotion, just care, just pulse, just survival. But with him, that oath began to tremble, because what I felt walking toward his bed wasn't neutral. It was warm. It was restless. It made me adjust my bun twice, straighten my dress, take a deep breath before touching wounded skin. And it wasn't love. Not yet. It was something older, maybe purer, maybe more dangerous. Recognition. Like my heart saw something in him it had known long before. Something the uniform couldn't erase. Days passed, and the silence between us filled with meaning. When I wiped his forehead with a damp cloth, he'd close his eyes slowly, as if surrendering not to pain, but to memory. When I brought him a glass of water, he held it with both hands, like it was sacred. And I started to realize that, in that infirmary where men died every day, he was the only one who reminded me I was still alive. But living has a cost, and in war, it's steep. One morning I found a note from Rose left on my supply table. Scrawled in haste, it read, "Be careful with what's not being said. People are watching." That was it. No names, no dates. But it was enough to send a chill down my spine. I pretended everything was normal that day, but my hands shook more than usual while preparing an injection. And while I pushed a dose of morphine into a boy whose abdomen had been torn open by shrapnel, my mind was with him. The man with gray eyes who whispered my name like an apology for a sin he never committed. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in the dark of our tent, listening to the distant rumble of trucks, and I asked myself, something I'd ask again and again later, at what point had we crossed the line? It wasn't just touch or gaze. It was the need to protect, and in the middle of a war, that was a violation, because protecting the enemy wasn't allowed, even if he had become more human to me than any of our commanding officers. The next day I heard he was being transferred. They said German High Command had identified him, that he held sensitive information and couldn't remain there. He would be taken to an interrogation facility. My knees buckled when I heard it, but no one noticed. I wore my white mask, as always, cold, precise, unshaken, and inside I was falling apart. I walked to his bed with frozen hands. He looked at me. He knew. He didn't ask anything. Just reached out. That thin hand, etched with scars even time wouldn't dare erase. And waited. I held it. Against orders. Against my code. Against reason. And in that simple human gesture I had to choose. Between the oath and the pulse. The oath said, "Do your duty. Care is duty. But do not cross the line. Do not love. Do not get attached. Do not get involved." The pulse said, "Stay. Feel. Protect. Carry his name with you, even if the world tries to erase it." And I chose the pulse. Before they took him away, I slipped a small handkerchief into the folds of his pillow. It was mine, embroidered with my initials, a piece of me he would carry wherever they dragged him. And it was more than a symbolic gesture. It was a muffled scream, a secret plea for him to know. Someone still cared. Even if no one else ever remembered his name, I would. As if memory were a second skin, a silent armor. When they removed him from the infirmary, I turned my face, pretended to be busy with a tray of instruments. But I heard his footsteps, and for a moment, breaking every rule, he said softly, in that wounded voice, "Danke, Mabel." And he was gone. I didn't cry. Not that day. I cried later, in the mess hall, between bites of cold rice and a tasteless glass of water. I cried like you cry for a brother who was never blood but was soul. Because he wasn't just a war story. He was a secret that ran straight through me. And he was mine. Only mine. And in that moment I knew. Yes, the war would end. But not for me. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't look back. When they took him, all I did was swallow hard and clench my fists, like I was holding my own body together to keep it from falling apart in front of everyone. I did what they expected. I kept walking between beds, changing dressings, cleaning pus, fixing pillows. I pretended his absence was just another empty cot, just another number crossed off the records with a black line. But inside, it felt like they'd ripped out a language I was only just learning how to speak. And still, the days went on. The routine of war has a cruelty few truly understand. It doesn't stop to mourn anyone. There's no space for grief, because there's always another body arriving, another pain demanding space, another urgency pushing you to function. So you learn to survive like a machine that breathes but doesn't feel, like a door that opens for everyone but never locks for itself. But the handkerchief I left for him, that small piece of cloth embroidered with my initials, was missing. I knew it. His absence wasn't just the silence of the bed where he once breathed. It was the empty spot where my handkerchief used to be, folded neatly in the little fabric box we kept our personal things in. Every day, I returned to the barracks like someone searching for a letter that would never come. I slept on my side, afraid to let my head touch the pillow, and remember how he used to say my name, that soft, drawn-out accent, like each letter had been dipped in water before leaving his mouth. 3 weeks passed like that. 3 weeks when no one said his name, no officer mentioned his transfer, no note, no whisper, no trace. And then, it happened. One night. Or rather, early morning. A convoy arrived in a rush, carrying wounded soldiers from an ambush up north. The place exploded into chaos. Shouts, lights, stretchers, muddy boots dragging sludge across the infirmary floor. And in the middle of it all, I saw him. Him. I didn't know how or why, but he was back, thinner, paler, hair shaved, a fresh scar near his ear. But it was him. My heart knew before my eyes did. And he saw me. He recognized me. He didn't speak, didn't smile, didn't move. But he looked at me. And that look, it was the same as the first time. Only now, no translation was needed. I learned later through one of the interpreters that he'd been held in a POW camp and relocated temporarily due to overcrowding and the severity of his injuries. He was in bad shape. Right arm immobilized, running a high fever, barely spoke. But he was there, again. Like a secret that refuses to stay buried no matter how many times you try. I had been assigned to another wing that week, but I requested a reassignment. I said I was more familiar with infected wound cases, which was true. I just didn't mention the real reason, that I needed to see him, to care for him, to make sure they wouldn't take him from me a second time without letting me hold his hand once more. And somehow, they agreed. The first night I walked into his wing again, I pretended to be surprised, followed protocol, checked his chart, took his temperature, recorded his vitals. But my eyes, they trembled, and he, still silent, followed every movement of mine with his gaze like it was sacred, as if the simple fact that I was there was already part of his healing. We didn't speak, not one word, but the silence between us was the same as before, a whole language on its own. I noticed he'd lost a lot of weight, his face more hollow, collarbones more visible. His left hand trembled, fingers stiff, but there was still strength in his eyes, and something more, something he kept hidden inside a hand-sewn pocket of his hospital tunic, a white cloth, dirty, wrinkled, but unmistakable. My handkerchief, the one I'd left under his pillow weeks earlier. He pulled it out with effort, and without looking directly at me, placed it beside the bed, like someone returning a vow, like someone saying, "I kept it." And in that moment I understood. He had never left me. Not really. Even when war tried, I cared for him for 6 days, in silence, like before. But this time with more tenderness, more pain, more weight in my body. Because now I knew time was short. that he wouldn't stay, that this time he might not come back. But in those 6 days I gave him everything the war hadn't taken from me yet. My calloused fingers, my quiet voice at dawn, my steady hands. And in return, he gave me the purest look I've ever known. He gave me back life just by letting me sit beside him while he slept. On the 6th day, I arrived at the infirmary and found his bed empty. A note pinned to the metal frame said he'd been transferred again. No explanation, no farewell, no trace. But this time, he left something for me. Inside my pocket that night, I found a small uniform button, sewn onto a piece of gray ribbon. It was from his uniform, a silent gesture, a wordless letter. And that was enough. Because on that base, where everything was fleeting, pain, gunpowder, loss, he called me back, even in silence. It was on that gray morning, with the fog creeping low across the tent field, that I realized something inside me no longer belonged to the uniform I wore. My boots still creaked as they pressed into hardened mud. My cap still hid my sweaty hair. My posture still mirrored that of a disciplined nurse. But inside, my heart had already gone AWOL. Not from the war, but from the rules that told me what I was allowed to feel. And maybe, if I had only been a nurse, maybe things would have been easier. But I was a woman, and my heart had already chosen a side that didn't wear stars and stripes, and didn't carry the same flag as mine. I remember the exact feeling of that moment, a dry heat in my chest, like something inside me was trying to break out. I walked between the beds holding a tray of antibiotics, following the daily routine. But something was out of place. Not in the room. In me. My fingers hesitated as I handed over pills. My mind wandered between smiles that never happened, words that were never spoken, and a name that could only be whispered in the darkness of memory. His image kept coming back no matter how hard I tried to push it away. The way he held my handkerchief with trembling fingers, the scar beneath his ear, the sound of his voice saying my name. It haunted me like a ghost. But it wasn't a ghost. It was real. It was flesh. It was a living memory. And more than that, it was the only place in the middle of all that death where I felt alive. Back at the barracks, Rose started watching me more closely. She didn't say anything, but her presence was no longer neutral. I noticed she whispered to the head nurse in voices too soft to hear, that she handed me fewer assignments in the central wings, that her once sweet eyes now held a kind of quiet sorrow, like she was mourning something that hadn't happened yet. And that's when I understood. They knew, or at least they suspected. And in war, that was enough. A suspicion, a name on a report, a rumor. And still, I went on, not out of stubbornness, but instinct. Something deep in me said that even under threat, even under watchful eyes, I couldn't go back. I couldn't undo a bond that had no knot. I couldn't pretend my heart still marched for the flag when it beat in the rhythm of a forbidden language. One afternoon, while folding clean sheets outside the infirmary, an American soldier walked over. He was young, eyes too bright for a face already burned by sun and war, and from his pocket he pulled a crumpled letter, handed it to me with an awkward smile and said, "Figured this was yours." I took the paper, and the second I opened it, the world stopped. It was my handwriting, my name. But it wasn't my letter. It was the note I'd left with the handkerchief. One simple line in plain English. "You are not alone." Someone had found it, and now it had come back to me like a warning, a threat, a quiet message with sharp teeth. My throat tightened, the paper screamed without a sound. And what screamed inside me was fear that someone, maybe everyone, already knew. I tucked the letter into my pocket, shut my eyes, and for the first time in weeks, I wanted to run, not from the war, but from myself, from the part of me that dared to love the wrong man, that dared to surrender, even in silence, to something the whole world called betrayal. But was it love? I didn't know. Not yet. What I did know was that there had been care. There had been tenderness. There had been faith. And there had been memory. And maybe, just maybe, that was more than love. Maybe it was redemption, a way of saying, I'm not what they want me to be. I'm something else. I'm someone who looked into the enemy's eyes and saw a reflection, and who, even afraid, didn't look away. That night I sat at the edge of my bed and cried in silence. Not tears of guilt, not even longing. Heavy tears, bitter tears, the kind that wash away what the soul can't carry anymore. And for the first time I wrote his name. On a scrap, torn from the nursing logbook. I don't know why. I had nowhere to keep it. But I wrote it, like lighting a candle in the dark. And then I tore it to pieces and let the wind take them. Because it was too late. My heart was already wearing the wrong uniform, and there was no going back. In war, no one teaches you what to do when the border cuts through your own chest, when the line that divides us and them vanishes beneath your feet, when your body still wears a uniform, but your soul has found a different home. And that night, with the distant hum of bombings in the air, I knew for sure I wasn't fighting for victory anymore. I was fighting to keep alive the memory of a name that couldn't be spoken, a name that existed only for me, and still kept me standing. The uniforms we wore at that base didn't have inner pockets. That was by design, of course. They didn't want us to carry anything, to hide anything, to keep anything. A nurse was meant to be a passage, hands in empty, hands out emptier, as if the body itself was just a vessel, for pain, for aid, for silence. But that didn't stop me from making my own pocket, a crooked little stitch, almost invisible, sewn into the left side of my apron, right over the heart, right where no one would ever think to look, because that's where I kept the secret that has followed me to this day. And that secret is still here. I sewed that pocket on a cold night, using a field needle and surgical thread. It was after he left. Not the first time. The second. The final time. It was late. The other nurses were asleep. I sat on the edge of my cot, fabric in my lap, eyes burning, index finger trembling. Sewing over your heart takes more courage than you'd think, and I needed every last ounce of mine to tighten the stitches. I didn't know if what I was doing was madness or memory, but I did it, because there was something I couldn't lose, something small, fragile, but heavier than any medal or photograph. His uniform button, that button, it wasn't just a button. It was what was left. It was everything. It was him. When I found it next to my tray of surgical tools, I knew instantly he had left it for me. There was no note, no name, but there was intent. He knew he couldn't say a word to me, but he gave me something that said everything. And when I held it for the first time, it felt like touching his hand again, like in that quiet gesture he had found a way to call me. Again, even from far away, even from the other side of the war. I wrapped the button in a piece of clean gauze, tied it with a white ribbon, and sewed it into the lining of my uniform, right along the new seam. And every day that followed, I walked with it pressed to my chest. No one knew. No one saw, but it was there, like a constant whisper, a reminder that not all care has to be visible to be real. That's how I learned the true weight of a secret, not the kind that drags you down like a stone in your gut, but the kind that gives you meaning, that anchors you, that keeps you from losing yourself in the chaos. That's what he was to me, an invisible anchor. And as strange as it sounds, it was precisely because I carried him in silence that I was able to keep going, to keep caring for others, smiling when I had to, cleaning wounds that smelled like the end of the world. Because inside me, right there, was something no one could take. One day, during an emergency relocation to another field unit, an officer asked to search our belongings. It wasn't uncommon. They were looking for contraband, enemy items, notes exchanged with prisoners. When it was my turn, I opened my bag without hesitation, showed him socks, rice paper, a pen, a handkerchief, a hairbrush. He glanced over everything with disinterest and waved me forward. But in that instant, my heart pounded so loudly, I thought everyone around me could hear. The button was still there, untouched, invisible. My secret had passed, as it always did, unnoticed. I never sewed that pocket into another uniform. When that one wore out, because in war, everything wears out early, I folded it and tucked it between the pages of an old medical notebook. And there it stayed for decades. The button inside the gauze inside the pocket inside a time that doesn't come back. Only much later, when the house had begun to groan with loneliness and the paint peeled from the walls, I rediscovered the uniform inside a cardboard box. And I cried with longing, cried with guilt, cried because, somehow, it was still real, still mine. People don't understand what it means to keep something for that long. They think it's clinging, nostalgia, but it's not. Sometimes keeping is the only form of resistance, because some war stories weren't made for books. They were made for skin, for the chest, for a pocket sewn by hand, in a uniform turned to dust, but still pulsing. Today the button is here, with me, on a small altar I've set up beside my bed, next to a white candle, a faded photograph, and a letter written in a language I never learned. But somehow, I understand, because love, real love, doesn't need to be shouted. It survives in the details. In a button, in a crooked stitch, in a pocket no one ever sees. It didn't happen with an explosion, or a scream, or an official letter stamped with a military seal. The day he stopped saying my name came without ceremony. No sirens, no warning. It was just a day like any other. A sky lightly overcast, wind slicing along the tent walls, the smell of overbaked bread drifting from the makeshift kitchen. I was folding sheets in a hurry, trying to beat the cold sneaking up my sleeves, when I felt something shift inside me. And only later, much later, did I understand what it was. The name he used to say, even in silence, was no longer there. It had vanished from the air, from memory, from the world. As if he had finally gone somewhere, names no longer matter. What was strange was the lack of confirmation. No one came to tell me he's gone. No doctor, no sergeant, no message. And maybe that's what hurt the most. Because doubt is the cruelest kind of silence. It's absence without a funeral. Grief with no address. And in that base, where everything smelled like endings, I kept waiting for a word that never came. A word that would tell me, it's over. But all I got was a void. For days I walked like a ghost. I still cared for the others, of course. Changed bandages, administered morphine, held sweaty hands through fevered dreams. But my body was hollow. Just a shell. And whatever had been inside me, whatever had pulsed and kept me moving, was gone. Because somehow, the world had reorganized itself without him. The beds had been shifted, the priorities redefined, and no one else seemed to remember the man in the wrong uniform who whispered my name like it was a blessing. So I started searching, quietly, in notes, charts, medical logs. I combed through old files, transfer lists, field diaries. Nothing. It was as if he'd been erased. As if his existence had been a clerical error that the war was now trying to correct. And that broke me. Because to the world, maybe he was disposable. A number, a statistic, a body in a neutral zone. But to me, he was name, he was sound. He was the voice that called me like no one ever had. With no answers, I began building rituals. Small ones, simple. Every day, at the end of my shift, I lit a candle in a corner of the supply tent. No altar, no prayer. Just the flickering flame and my silence. I'd sit there for a few minutes, waiting. Not for a miracle, but for memory. Because I was terrified that if I didn't, his name would vanish from my mind. And if that happened, then he really would be gone. The other nurses said I looked distracted, that my eyes drifted too far. Maybe they were right, because I wasn't whole anymore. One part of me stayed behind, with the empty bed, the sewn-in button, the letter written in a language I never learned. The other part pretended, did what was expected. And that's how I survived, half woman, half ghost. And then the letter came. Not from him, from his sister. She was an interpreter. She'd found my name in a set of shared records. She'd learned of the care I'd given. She knew, or guessed, that there had been more between us. And she wrote to me. In English, simple words, shaky spelling. She said he had been transferred again, wounded during transport. That he'd hung on for 2 days. That near the end he'd called out for someone, but no one understood what he said. And that in his hands, they found a button, tied with a white ribbon. She sent a description. It was mine. It took me days to open that letter. Even more to accept what it said. Because part of me still believed he was alive. That he'd return a 3rd time. That he'd walk past me and say, one last time, my name, giving it back to me like life. But no. The name he used to say in that soft, accented voice, with his eyes, with his hands, had gone silent. And with it, a part of me went quiet too. I never told anyone about the letter, not even Rose. I folded the paper and slipped it inside the same uniform that held the button. Sewed the edge closed, like a second pocket. And that's where it stayed, to this day. Because some things aren't meant to be buried, only kept. And sometimes, keeping is the only way to keep alive. When I came back home, the garden was still there. At least, the shape of it. The white wooden fence, the rose bushes lining the side of the porch, the little trellis covered in trembling bougainvillea my mother had planted back before we even had a radio. It looked like time had waited for me. But it only took a few weeks to realize it hadn't. It had just paused. Like me. Like everything that no longer knew how to bloom. The first few weeks were filled with forced celebration. Neighbors came to greet me. They said I had served with honor, that I was a credit to our little town. I got a cake, 2 bouquets of flowers, even a mention in the local paper. But no one had any idea who I was on the inside. And I didn't bother to explain. Because how could I? What words could contain it all? What part of that honor included the tiny weight inside my dress pocket, where I kept his button, stitched with nursing thread and a woman's aching memory? My mother wanted me to cut my hair. Said it was time to look presentable. My father spoke proudly of the wounds I must have witnessed, like seeing death somehow made me stronger. My uncles, veterans of the previous war, asked about tanks, about planes, about territory. But no one asked about love. No one asked if I'd left anyone behind. Because in their minds, nurses didn't live emotional stories, only useful ones. We helped. We healed. We saved. We didn't fall in love. We didn't bleed on the inside. That's when I realized the garden had stopped too. The flowers no longer bloomed like before. The soil seemed drier, even after rain. And the seedlings I planted with care, with hope, just withered. At first I blamed the weather, then the soil. But the truth was me. It was my hand that no longer pulsed. It was my soul that had dried out. I started tending the garden like someone trying to save herself. I pruned with precision, watered on schedule, fertilized, moved the plants around. But nothing took. It was as if the garden knew, as if it had heard the name I would never hear again, as if it felt the absence of the man who used to say my name like he was watering me. Outwardly, my life fell into order. I went back to work, became a nurse at the local hospital, attended parties, baptisms, funerals. I smiled for photos, lent out dresses. But it was all wallpaper, all backdrop, because inside there was only the garden, and it was barren, like a womb that stopped before it could carry, like a war story no one ever told, but whose roots kept writing themselves dry and deep inside me. Over the years I received 3 marriage proposals. None moved me. One was too gentle, another too loud. The last one smelled of impatience. But all of them shared one thing in common. Not one would have understood that button on my altar. Not one would have accepted sleeping beside a woman who, at night, whispered a name in a different language. I told everyone I didn't want children. It wasn't true. But it was easier that way, because the only child I ever dreamed of would have had gray eyes and a foreign name. He would have heard stories of war told with tenderness, not hate. He would have grown up knowing that love has no flag. But he never existed, could never exist. And the emptiness he left grew up with me. Now the garden is just a frame of tired earth. There are still plants. Some hang on. Others sprout only to die a few days later. And I keep watering, pruning, trying. As if in doing so, I could fool life. As if I could say, see, I can still care. But the truth is, since he left, nothing's taken root. Because some roots don't go into the ground, they go into the chest. And from there, they don't bloom. Every night, before turning off the lights and crawling into bed, I light a candle. Not out of faith, not out of habit. I light it like someone calling back a name that time tried to erase. A presence reality insists on denying. It's a small white candle, unscented, simple. But it holds more truth than any prayer I've ever dared to say aloud. Because as long as its flame flickers there, on the old wood of my bedside table, something inside me stays lit too. Something that never died, something that still loves. My altar doesn't have a cross, no saints, no holy figures. It holds a uniform button sewn into a faded gray ribbon. A letter folded 4 times, written in a language I never learned but whose curves I know by heart. A strip of gauze, still stained with faded red. And a blurred photograph, no face left to see, held by a rust-eaten pin. And above it all, there is silence, a thick, old, sacred kind of silence, because everything I placed there was never spoken, never shown, never allowed, but never forgotten either. This house once had other sounds. It once knew loud radios on Sundays, porch conversations, laughter from the kitchen, even marriage proposals. Now, all it hears are short footsteps and the scratch of a match striking flame. And still, it stands, just like me. Even if the windows groan, even if the walls peel, even if the plant in the living room refuses to bloom. There's something in me, and in this house, that insists on holding on, insists on remembering, as if love itself were a form of resistance. Some people call it loneliness. They say I'm a woman who chose to stay alone. But it was never a choice. It was loyalty. And not loyalty to a man. Loyalty to a feeling no one else ever saw. To a war story that never made the papers but marked my body more deeply than any medal ever could. A love that didn't ask permission or offer apologies. It simply came. Cut through everything. And when it left behind an altar. Sometimes I sit there, watching the candle dance by itself. And I wonder, did he know? Did he, in the end, feel that I would still call for him night after night? Did he imagine his memory would have a home, a space, an altar? And then, I remember how he used to say my name, softly, with reverence, with that accent heavy with childhood, snow and borders. And I know, yes, he knew. There were nights I thought about packing everything away, about putting the button in a box, donating it to a museum, forgetting, burning the letter, tossing the gauze, starting over. But how do you start over when what you lost was the name that gave meaning to the life before? How do you begin again when the language that once called you has vanished from every living mouth? So I left it all as it was. The altar remains. The candle is lit. The flame dances. And with it, so do the memories, the gestures, the words never spoken, the touch that never happened, the kiss that never existed. And all of it lives on right there, every night. Because loving someone in silence is building an altar with your own hands. It's keeping alive what the world tried to erase. And that's why I'm writing now. Not to confess a secret, but to keep the flame going. So that somewhere, someone knows he existed, that he had a name, that there was a nurse who loved him. With her eyes, her gestures, her presence. Even when the whole world said she wasn't allowed to. Some people leave legacies in safes, others in photo albums. I left mine sewn inside a uniform that doesn't even exist anymore, but still weighs on my chest like it's alive. My secret never had paperwork, never had witnesses. It only had a button, a flame, and my name, spoken by someone who wasn't supposed to call me. And yet, it was the only time I ever felt truly called. Today, in this quiet house where the clock moves too slowly and the walls remember everything I try to forget, I still feel him. Not like a ghost, but like a faithful absence. Like wind passing through a place where flowers once grew. I sit in my rocking chair as I'm doing now and stare ahead without rush, as if waiting for someone to walk through the door. And when I light my candle, that little white flame that barely casts a shadow, I speak his name, silently, even if I never pronounce it right, because that doesn't matter. What matters is that every night someone still calls him. I kept everything inside because I knew no one would understand. Because loving someone from the other side of the war doesn't belong in history books. It doesn't fit in parades or medals or patriotic speeches. But it fits in the chest. It fits in memory. It fits in the altar we build when the world takes everything, except our ability to remember. So if you've stayed with me this far, thank you, truly, because you've heard what no one else wanted to hear, because you've made space for a war story that doesn't end with gunfire, but with silence, with a candle lit, with an old woman staring at a uniform button like she's looking at everything that could have been. And if this story, in any way, touched you, if you've ever loved in silence, ever lost without being able to scream, ever held a name tucked away in your heart, then you're not alone. We're together. And maybe, deep down, this story is ours. Share it. Comment. Light your own candle. And if you can, remember the name of the one who loved you, even when the world said they couldn't. because that's the kind of love that never disappears. It was made to last, even in silence.